Today, I've got the pleasure of having Lou from Tropic Marin with me. Lou, how are you?
I'm awesome because I'm here now with you.
Yay! Thank you so much for coming. I know it's a long way. I'm in Nova Scotia, Canada.
It's a long way. You're out in the middle of nowhere.
Not a lot of people know that.
I didn't know that. I thought, I watch your videos and I figure you're in a city somewhere. Then I said, I'll go visit them.
I'm in the country.
You're way in the country.
It's just trees for as far as you can see. So today, Lou came to talk with me about all things carbon dosing. So if carbon dosing is something you've been thinking about, or maybe you've never heard of it, and you want to learn more about carbon dosing and what it's for and what you're supposed to do and how to do it, this is going to be the video for you. So let's start with the basics, and that is, what is carbon dosing and why would you want to do it?
Good questions. And if you haven't done carbon dosing and you think you don't need to, this is what you want to find out about.
Exactly.
So start with way back. Coral polyps absolutely need phosphates.
Yes.
And everybody looks at their nitrate-phosphate ratio, and we talk about the nitrate-phosphate ratio, which actually isn't all that important. By the way, those of you that are looking at the Redfield weight ratio, throw it out. Redfield ratio was done on surface algae in deep water.
Right.
Has nothing to do with corals. Right. If you look at the nitrate phosphate ratio in the water column on a coral reef, it's close to 1 to 1.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, close to 1 to 1, 2 to 1 maybe. If you look at the nitrogen phosphate ratio, maybe you could push that up to 3 or 4 to 1, but not much higher than that. The Redfield ratio is what, 17 or 18?
Yeah, almost 20 to 1.
Something like that. So throw Redfield out, sorry Redfield, and realize that ratio is actually more like 1 to 1 or 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 at best. The problem is that coral polyps don't have a great mechanism for getting the phosphate directly from the water column.
Okay.
All right?
So they can't just absorb it through their membranes that easily.
Very tough to get dissolved phosphate that's floating around. The phosphate that we test for in a test kit, very tough for them to get that phosphate directly from the water column.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, they have a great mechanism for getting the nitrate and the nitrogen directly from the water column, but they're not getting their nitrogen compounds from nitrate.
Okay.
Which is also a whole other thing we should talk about at some point, but we measure totally the wrong thing in a tank. In a reef tank, we measure the nitrate, and we think that's giving us the indication of what those coral polyps are getting for their nitrogen, and has nothing to do with it because the coral polyps are getting their nitrogen compounds from urea and from ammonium, not from nitrate. Okay? The reason nitrate tends to build up in an aquarium is because nothing uses it. The coral polyps don't use it for their nitrogen, and that's why it builds up. Okay? The ammonium and urea don't build up because the coral polyps are taking them to get their nitrogen compounds. But they don't have the ability to get phosphate the same way.
So what's the main mechanism for them getting phosphate?
Particulate undissolved phosphate.
Okay.
Mostly on a coral reef from fish poop.
Sounds about right.
So what happens is the phosphate concentration in the water column is very low, and then a big school of Anthias or Heniochus come by, and they defecate all over the reef. Now you've got this shower of undissolved particulate phosphate showering down onto the corals, and they have a great mechanism for getting the phosphate from that undissolved particulate phosphate.
Which goes hand in hand with a lot of stories I've heard about having more fish, especially in SPS systems, being better for the corals.
Yeah, totally, because you're feeding them, the fish are pooping, and then the corals can get their phosphate. So what we do with carbon dosing is that we promote the growth of beneficial bacteria that do have a good mechanism for getting that phosphate from the water column. So they grow, they take the phosphate for the water column, and now that bacteria is a particulate, undissolved phosphate carrier. Now the corals can eat that bacteria and get that particulate phosphate that they can't get directly from the water column.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is through carbon dosing and the promotion of these beneficial bacteria that are going to help pull this excess nutrients out of the water, the nitrate and phosphate specifically. So they're going to reduce those levels, hold it in their tissue, in their body. Then they are the mechanism for corals to be able to pull that in, because the corals will end up eating that bacteria. So through carbon dosing, you're not only reducing nutrients, but you're also providing a way for your reef to access those nutrients efficiently.
100%. And in fact, that's the important point. If your phosphates are high and you're using something like GFO, right, to get that phosphate down, what you're doing is you're taking that phosphate out of the water column and other things, by the way, that you don't want to take out. Not that I'm against GFO, but GFO doesn't take specifically just phosphate out of the water column. Sure. So you're taking that phosphate, you're absorbing it into the GFO, and then you're taking the GFO and throwing it away. And that phosphate is essential for your coral polyps.
Right.
So it would be much more effective for the corals if you could take that phosphate in the water column, put it into some form that the corals can get, which is the bacteria, and then let the corals absorb it that way. You still reduce the phosphate in the water column, but now you're funneling it to the coral polyps instead of funneling it to your trash.
Which sounds like a much more complete kind of way of approaching the ecosystem, instead of just exporting it to nowhere and then having to find a different way to get those phosphates back into your system in a way that your corals can actually appreciate it and use it.
Yeah, exactly.
This is a mechanism that does both at the same time, which is really cool. So you specifically mentioned that it promotes the growth of bacteria. And I know some forms of carbon dosing have been anecdotally reported to cause issues with other bacterias or things you wouldn't want popping up in the tank, namely like cyanobacteria.
Yeah.
So when it comes to carbon dosing, how likely are you to end up fueling some sort of bacterial bloom or algae that you don't want?
Another really good question. Depends on the carbon source, all right?
Okay.
In general, and this is not a 100% hard, fast rule, but in general, all bacterias can use short chains. They want short polymer chains.
Okay.
Short carbon chains, right? That's what they all want. The beneficial bacteria has the ability to take longer carbon chains and split it up into those small components that it needs. The bacteria that we don't want to grow, in general, again, not 100%, but in general, the bacteria that we don't want to grow, things like cyanobacteria and other bad guys in our tanks, don't have the ability to do that. So if the carbon source that we're giving is something that is, in general, made up of very short carbon chains like
Vodka.
alcohol, vodka, vinegar, sugars, right? These are all very short carbon chains. So they're going to be beneficial for the good guys that we want to grow.
And everybody else.
And everybody else, right? If we supply the tank with longer carbon chains, then those guys that we don't want to grow don't have as much ability to use that because they don't have a mechanism for breaking it down, where the good guys do have a mechanism for breaking those down and using them. So it depends on the type of carbon chains that you're putting in the tank. And I think the reason that carbon dosing has this bad rap of, I started carbon dosing with, and I don't want to nail either vodka or vinegar or sugar, but I started carbon dosing with one of those, general things, and I grew a bunch of cyanobacteria.
Right.
Well, of course you did, because you fed it, right? But if we feed the tank these longer carbon chains, the cyanobacteria doesn't have that ability to break that down. But the beneficial bacteria that's going to funnel that phosphate to the coral polyp does have the ability to do that. So it's not It's not a hard, fast rule. I'm not going to say 100% if you use this type of carbon chain, you'll never grow cyanobacteria. If you use that type of carbon chain, you always will. But in general,
it's either increasing or decreasing the likelihood, which I would assume is pretty substantially, because if they just don't have a mechanism, those bad guys don't have a mechanism to break down those longer carbon chains, they would have to wait until something that does start splitting it up. And if the thing that is splitting it up is using it all, then I don't see how they'd ever really get the opportunity.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm not a chemist, so I don't know what the exact mechanism is that happens there. But the point is that in general, the longer carbon chains are going to promote the beneficial bacteria primarily, where the shorter carbon chains promote all bacterial growth, some of which we're not so crazy about having.
Absolutely. The last thing you want to do is try to solve one problem and create an entirely other problem.
Which we've all done from time to time.
If I had $1 for every time I've made a mistake in my reef tank and caused myself more problems trying to fix it, I'd be rich by now. But instead, I still just have an aquarium and I'm not rich.
It actually does exactly the opposite.
Exactly. In all cases. All right. So now we've got a pretty solid idea of why you'd want to carbon dose and how to basically avoid ending up with things you don't want when you're carbon dosing, because it is possible, but there's a way essentially to avoid it by just using a product that will not allow those other things to get a hold of it. The real question now becomes, how do you know how to... I've got two questions. How do you know when you should start carbon dosing? And how do you know how much you should be carbon dosing? Is there like a steadfast rule to either of them, or is there like a general rule of thumb that will get you on the right track?
I don't know of a reef tank that can't benefit from some carbon dosing. So the answer to the first question is just do it. If you have a reef tank and you have polyps that need the phosphate, just do it. It's going to be beneficial for you. I don't think there's a type of polyp, at least that I know of, that doesn't benefit from that phosphate availability. Right. They all need that, right? So the answer to the first question is, if you have a reef tank, just do it. The second one, what was the second question?
How do you know how much you should be carbon dosing?
Okay, so most companies that make carbon dosing products make one product.
Right.
And if you want to lower the phosphate in the water column more, you use more of that product, okay? Tropic Marin handles it a completely different way. What we do is we go by the optimal range of phosphate in your water column, regulating that by the type of carbon dosing that you're doing.
Right.
All right, so the optimum range has changed a little bit.
Oh, okay.
So some of you have this chart that we made up that has kind of a disc on it that rotates, and it shows 0.03 ppm as the bottom end of the range, and 0.1 ppm as the top end of the optimal range.
For phosphate, yeah.
I've actually learned more and more about this as time has gone on, and I've changed my numbers somewhat, so I need to reprint that.
We adapt.
We adapt. So the optimum range now, in my opinion, is the bottom end is about 0.05 ppm, right?
So not as low as it was previously.
Not as low as it was previously, so about 0.05 ppm. And I've pushed the top end of the range, for me, up to about 0.15 ppm. Okay. You don't really tend to see much algae growth or any issues at all if you're as high as 0.15. I know people that even run 0.17 and 0.18 and are doing fine, right? So that would be kind of the optimum range, in my opinion, right now, 0.05 to 0.15. Now, if you're below 0.05 ppm phosphate, with Tropic Marin products, you're going to use the plus NP.
Okay.
All right?
So I'm guessing that means it's going to bring the levels.
Right. This is going to add phosphates and nitrogen compounds.
So with the plus NP, is it just the nitrate and nitrogen and phosphate in there, or is there something else in there too?
With the plus NP, it's primarily adding the nitrogen compounds and the phosphates. But there is a tiny bit of carbon dosing in there to get that process started.
Gotcha.
The interesting thing that you want to understand here is that the N stands for nitrogen compounds, not nitrate.
Right. Because
So
like you were saying earlier, it's not the nitrate the corals actually want.
They want the urea and the ammonium.
Okay.
So when you add this product, you will see the phosphates go up, and eventually you will see the nitrates go up, because what happens is when those animals are getting their nitrogen compounds from the urea and the ammonium, eventually the nitrates start to rise slightly.
Right.
But this doesn't add nitrate per se.
Okay.
All right.
So you won't be able to test for it right away. Eventually, when those compounds are being used up and the end result ends up being some nitrate, that will start appearing.
Yes, and you can for the phosphate, though. You add it and you'll see the phosphate.
Perfect.
All right. So this is also a really good product for people that have low phosphate and acceptable nitrate levels, because it's not going to raise those nitrate levels immediately.
Perfect.
All right.
Okay.
So this is going to raise the phosphate level up from below that 0.05 ppm up to a point that's more in your range, 0.05 to 0.15 ppm. All right.
Okay.
I like to see people go higher in that range before they switch over to the NP-Bacto balance, rather than the minute they get to 0.05, switch over to the NP-Bacto balance, because then the carbon dosing kicks in,
and it's going to start pulling it down.
There's some bounce back.
Right.
So I like to see people go up to like 0.1 ppm at least before they start with the NP-Bacto balance. All right. So that's the plus NP. Then you've got the NP-Bacto balance. Now, this is a funny product because people always say, well, my nitrate phosphate ratio isn't right. Will the NP-Bacto balance fix that? The answer is no. That's not what it does. What it does is that it keeps your phosphates in that range so that it balances that phosphate for you. It doesn't push it there. It has carbon dosing in it, which helps bring the phosphate level down, but it also adds phosphates and nitrogen compounds to keep it in that range.
So this is essentially the carbon dosing with some portion of the nitrogen compounds and phosphate together.
Correct.
So that you can this is another thing about carbon dosing that I've always been really worried about, is like bottoming everything out.
Totally.
So this basically prevents you from ever just bottoming out, because
Yes.
you're feeding the bacteria just enough to keep those levels in a comfortable spot.
Exactly.
Perfect.
All
So
right.
this is like carbon dosing for dummies.
If your levels are in the acceptable range to begin
Already,
with.
okay.
All
So
right?
you get them to where they need to be, and then this is going to prevent you from doing anything detrimental by like just carbon dosing blind and then tanking everything.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, with one little caveat.
Whoa! Okay, what's the
There's always
caveat?
an exception to the rule.
Of course.
Your phosphate and nitrate levels in any system that you have is going to be dependent upon your input and your export. Export being both really exporting out of the system altogether, like with a protein skimmer or GFO or something like that.
AlgaTurf scrubber, something that's pulling it out and removing it from the system, sure.
Or export out of the water column into your corals, right?
Okay.
That's also a form of export. It's
Absolutely.
just export out of the water column. Your phosphate and nitrate levels are always going to be dependent upon your import and your export. So sometimes you're going to use the NP-Bacto balance, and you're still going to see those phosphate levels decreasing a little or increasing a little.
Gotcha.
Because it doesn't match your import and export exactly. So it doesn't mean that if you're using the NP-Bacto balance, you can stop testing and never ever worry again, and it's always going to balance your nitrate phosphates. That's not the way it works. It's going to add a certain amount of nitrate and phosphate, which matches the amount of phosphate uptake that you should have given the amount that you're using. But if your system is exporting some phosphates or nitrates or importing more than that,
You're heavy-handed with feeding.
right, exactly, then those levels are going up or down.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
All right. So most people end up using the NP-Bacto balance, and it ends up balancing the system out very nicely over a long period of time. But you still keep a watch on your phosphate and nitrate levels because you may have to adjust as time goes on, given your particular import and export quantities.
Gotcha. So the Elima NP is, how does that work? Is it essentially back to balance without any addition?
In the Elima NP, it's all about carbon dosing.
Okay.
All right.
So the Elima NP is NP back to balance without the NP.
Correct.
And then the
Plus
NP is NP back to balance with extra NP.
Correct.
Gotcha.
And with the Elima NP, all you're trying to do is to get that phosphate level
Increase
down,
that bacteria
get it into that
population.
bacteria so your corals can take it down.
Perfect. Gotcha.
All right? So if your phosphate level is above 0.15, you use the Elima NP to help get it down into that range.
Okay.
And when it gets down to about 0.1 ppm, you switch over to the NP back to balance.
Gotcha. Okay, I have a question. So if, let's say I'm running a reef tank and my phosphates are where I want them to be, my nitrates seem to be where I want them to be, everything's going great, and I just love the idea, because this is exactly who I am, I just love the idea of doing some amount of carbon dosing to help my corals get what they want by feeding this bacteria and making these little phosphate nitrogen burgers that they can then eat and do a better job growing and consuming, building tissue and all that. Can I do like a minimal amount or like just add some amount of doing NP back to balance?
That's exactly what that's for.
And then I don't have to really overthink anything. I'm just going to start doing this in small amounts, whatever it is.
If your nitrate phosphate level is where you want it to be, that's what you want to use. That's going to give you the carbon dosing, but replenish the nitrogen and phosphate that the carbon dosing is taking out.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, so if your tank is exactly where you want it to be, your corals look great, you don't have a problem. You're not trying to like reduce your nutrients, but you're like, you know what? Among amino acids and other things that I'm feeding my corals, I think this could be a really good mechanism to try to even go a bit further with the biology of my tank and give my corals what they want. I'm just gonna add a little bit of NP back to balance because it is a safer form of carbon dosing, number one. I'm less likely to get like slimes and stuff from it because it's long form carbon chains. Plus it's got a little bit of the phosphate and nitrogen in it, so I'm not gonna be messing with my current levels very much at all, but I'm gonna get my corals what they want. However, if your tank is not in balance right now and you're like, okay, I want to try carbon dosing specifically to start lowering nutrient levels or getting things where they should be and try to deal with some of these algae issues I'm having, I can then use this almost as a complete system to get myself where I need to be and then switch over to just carbon dosing for the sake of keeping things where they should be and keeping my corals full.
For the sake of funneling that phosphate in your system
into a usable form.
Your corals.
Exactly.
Because your corals can virtually thrive without a whole bunch of nitrate in the system.
Right.
They will not thrive
without
if they
phosphate.
can't get the phosphate.
Right. Okay. That is the first time that I've had a carbon dosing system explained to me in a way that isn't just, I have high nutrients, I've got algae, I want to get rid of it, I'm going to carbon dose. Virtually every other carbon dosing system I've ever seen, which is, first of all, every other system I've seen was one part, just carbon dosing. But every other time I've looked at carbon dosing or have had it explained to me, it was always for the express purpose of just bringing nutrients down and fighting algae. The Tropic Marin system, from what I'm hearing, absolutely can help you accomplish that. But first and foremost, this is like, we are going to take the nutrients in your system, stick it in a way, into a form that your corals can use because they need it.
Yep.
And then we're going to give it to them.
Yeah, it's actually a discussion that I have with a lot of people that they're always talking about using carbon dosing to lower the nutrient level. And it's like, yes, it does that, but that's not the most important thing it does. The most important thing it does is to make that crucial phosphate super available to those coral polyps. That's the primary thing it does. The byproduct is that if the corals can get it, they take it out of the water column through the use of the bacteria, and that lowers the phosphate in the water column. Now this brings up one other question that I get asked all the time.
Hit me.
Which is, my phosphates are in a good range, but my nitrates are high. What do I do?
Okay.
People ask that to me all the time.
I can imagine.
What do you do?
Add phosphate somehow? What do you do? I don't know.
Much simpler answer to it.
What?
The simplest, easiest way to lower the nitrates. Remember, your corals are not sucking up those nitrates for their nitrogen.
Does water change it?
Water changes.
That, in retrospect, that is pretty obvious.
You do a 20% water change, you get rid of 20% of the nitrates that are causing you problems in your tank.
Right.
So the easiest way to adjust that nitrate level, if your nitrates are too high and your phosphates look good, is do a few aggressive water changes and get rid of the nitrates. You do 20% water changes and you got rid of a ton of your nitrates, and now you're in good shape. And then look at your feeding, see if your feeding is a little heavy, because remember, any food that you put into that system, whether your fish or corals eat it or not, ends up as nitrates.
Yeah.
So if you're constantly fighting a high nitrate level, the easiest thing to do is do those water changes, get rid of some of those nitrates, and then drop back a little bit on your feeding and see if that makes a difference.
That makes perfect sense.
And if you're fighting with a high phosphate level, take a look at the foods that you're using, because in some of the foods, there's a lot of phosphate as preservative.
Yes.
And so sometimes that import becomes way greater than the export system that you have. If phosphate is listed as one of the first, say, 3 or 4 ingredients in your foods, in any of your foods, coral foods or fish foods, that could be where the excess phosphate's coming from.
That makes perfect sense. And it's funny that, like, a lot of people will associate frozen foods with being very nutrient dense and phosphate heavy, especially the liquid, and they'll strain it and all that stuff. But it is a really good point that a lot of even prepared foods that you can just buy in a jar, if phosphate is the preservative, it is going to add a lot more phosphate than you realize.
I have to say something about frozen foods too. If you're using frozen foods, be sure to look at the ingredient list. It will say sometimes dry weight. And sometimes you're looking at extremely high protein content, but that extremely high protein content is, and now don't get me wrong here, I'm not against frozen foods, but there are certain frozen foods where the ingredient is listed as dry weight. And that completely changes as soon as that's hydrated.
Right.
Now it's an extremely low protein content. So you want to look at the ingredient list to see if it's dry weight or wet weight.
So this isn't the only way to do carbon dosing. There are other methods. This is one method of carbon dosing. I know for a long time people use biopellets as a form of carbon dosing. I see that less and less now. I'm not sure why that is exactly, but
I can tell you why.
Tell me why.
Well, standard, I don't want to say standard, most carbon dosing pellets are made out of a degradable bioplastic.
Right. I've always heard it was like from the brewing industry or something.
I think it's actually from the industry that makes degradable utensils.
Okay.
You know, like forks and knives. And
absolutely.
I'm not 100% sure about that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it's from. Once again, being the Tropic Marin guy, I have to talk about Tropic Marin.
Absolutely.
Pellets. We have our NP Bacto pellets. And these are very different. These are not made with that type of plastic. Now, I don't want to say they're not made with plastic because polymers are plastic.
Yeah.
And so there's a little confusion there. But they're a different type of polymer.
Right.
And the cool thing about the Tropic Marin NP Bacto pellets is that you're using them in a fluidized bed.
Right.
Now, one important thing is that you want to make sure that all of the pellets are fluidized right down to the bottom. They all need to be moving.
You don't want them stacked or crunched up on each other.
Because they will kind of glue together in time if they're not moving. But the cool thing about this, one of the cool things is that, you know, when we're using fluidized beds or canisters of any type, the traditional adjustment of that is always maximum water flow. You know, if you're, whatever the media that's in there in a fluidized bed, you're trying to get the maximum so that it doesn't come out the top, but it is right up to the top.
Yes.
With pellets, for carbon dosing, it's exactly the opposite.
You want them moving as little as possible?
As little as possible, but still moving.
Gotcha.
And the principle there is you want the water to be in contact with the pellet for the maximum amount of time so that that bacterial growth happens effectively.
If it's moving too fast, the bacteria doesn't have as much
The water
opportunity.
just zooms right through. The nutrients are just zoom right through. Bacteria never gets a chance to grab those nutrients.
They need that like dwell time to actually.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
So you want to have all of the pellets fluidized right down to the very bottom, but you want to have the minimum flow that keeps all of the pellets fluidized.
Gotcha.
Now the cool thing about using that method of carbon dosing is that once you get it adjusted, you're done. It's an automatic carbon dosing system that is very gentle. That type of polymer is a less aggressive carbon dosing than what we're talking about when we're talking about the NP back to balance or the plus NP or the limit NP. It's very gentle and slow acting, and it's constant. So once you get that fluidized bed adjusted,
you just walk
go have a hamburger, you're done.
Nice.
And then
that sounds like my kind of reefing.
Right, exactly. And what you'll notice is that over time, that because you're at the minimum flow, that flow is going to go down a little. It's going to decrease. You'd grow a little slime inside the tubes and whatever. So you do have to check it from time to time and keep turning it up a little bit. But it's all automatic and it's all done and it happens and it's a beautiful thing without having to mess with it, which is really nice.
So then why aren't people gravitating towards that more?
I think just because it's another piece of equipment.
Yeah, that's fair.
You know, it's
a lot easier to pick up a bottle and do this than...
Exactly. But you can do it without adding a whole other pump. If you have a sump, what you can do is you can put the pellet reactor, I put it on a little stand in the pump, so it's up in the sump, so it's up a little bit above the water level.
Okay.
And then you can run a Y off of the return from your tank system down into the sump.
Ball valve?
Put a ball valve on it and just the flow from there, and then let the fluidized bed just dump right into the sump. So then you're not adding an extra pump in any way. It's just happening naturally off of the return.
So if you already have a manifold on your system, then you're just using one of the ports from the manifold to feed the reactor, which makes perfect sense.
And let it dump right into the sump so that you don't have to do anything to return it.
So if it's NP back to pellets, does that mean those pellets also have phosphate and nitrogen?
No, that's just carbon dosing.
Okay,
but it's a very, very mild, slow-acting form of carbon dosing.
Okay.
So
still gentle, not like you're not going to strip everything out of your water by accident.
You don't usually see the kind of nutrient, run down to zero that you do sometimes with an aggressive dose of a limit NP. You don't usually see that happen with the pellets.
Okay.
The other cool thing about the pellets is that you can use the pellets, and we're going to talk about the Reef Actif in a second. You can use the pellets and the Reef Actif at any phosphate level.
Okay.
So it's not like the other products where you need to add one if it's low, one if it's high. You can use the NP-Bacto pellets or the Reef Actif at any of the phosphate levels, and you can use it along with any of these other products. So you're using the pellets, for instance, you're running that reactor. Let's say your phosphate goes up a little too high. Use a little limit NP with it to get it down. Let's say it goes down a little bit too low. Use a little bit of the plus NP to get it up a little bit. So you can still use those other products for adjusting the phosphate level, and you're getting that very gentle, constant, automatic carbon dosing from the pellets. It's a wonderful product.
You're still feeding your corals. You're still packaging that phosphate and nitrogen in a way that your corals are going to be able to uptake, which is the key thing.
And The other thing about the pellets that you need to know is that in time they will degrade because the bacteria are actually eating those pellets. So every 6 or 8 months you need to put some more pellets in. And when you clean your system, take a good look at that that fluidized bed to make sure that those very bottom pellets are still fluidized, because if that flow goes down, those bottom pellets will kind of settle into the bottom.
Right, and if they have congealed, then that means you're not going to be able to tumble them. They're not going to work very efficiently. So those ones you'd want to pull out and then replace?
Yeah, you can pull them out. You can also just
break them up.
You can just shake it up a little bit. They generally break right apart.
Perfect.
Yeah, they generally break right apart. Then the other product that kind of goes along with all of this is the Reef Active.
Right.
Now the Reef Active is a different form of carbon dosing than the products that we're looking at with the Plus NP and the NP Bacto Balance.
Okay.
It's a different form of carbon dosing. It's long chain marine polymers. These are the same polymers that do this in the ocean from seaweed.
I was going to ask, it sounds like something derived from seaweed.
Yeah, it's a seaweed thing. It's very gentle, it's very slow acting, and you're adding that to the system, again, independent of your phosphate level, and you're funneling those phosphates to the bacteria that the corals can eat and consume and get that phosphate that they need. So the Reef Active is another one that, independent of the phosphate level, you can use these other products to adjust that phosphate level if you need to. And you can use the Reef Active with these. You can also use the Reef Active with the pellets. So you can run the pellets, the Reef Active, and then use these other products to adjust your phosphate level if need be.
Gotcha. So, man, this kind of leads me into a separate question altogether. But Reef Active, I'm assuming, is the exact same carbon dosing that's in bioactive.
Bioactive salt.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So that's this. Okay.
Now the advantage there is that if you do water changes, if you do regular water changes, the bioactive salt, and I know we're going to do a whole different video on salt, but we're there right now, so we might as well talk about it. The bioactive salt is the Pro Reef salt, is exactly the Pro Reef salt, with the addition of one additional DKH, so a tiny bit higher in alkalinity, and it already has the Reef Active in it. So when you do your water change, you're automatically doing a very low level of gentle carbon dosing.
That's really interesting. Can you, by that, from that understanding of it, if you're using, let's say, not Tropic Marin salt, not Tropic Marin salt, and you wanted to have a similar experience, could you just add the bioactive to your premixed salt water and then add it to your tank and get a similar effect?
The Reef Active?
The Reef Active, yeah. Sorry, these names are, take me a second.
I wouldn't do that. What I would do is, and don't ever tell my company in Germany that I'm saying something if you use a different salt. But if you were using a different salt, and it was a salt that didn't have any additives of any kind.
Yeah, no bioactive anything.
I would rather see you use the Reef Active as instructed directly in the tank system rather than put it in your water change water.
Okay.
Just because I don't know
it's more predictable. Like the interaction is going to turn out. So so I guess, just follow the instructions, but you can get a similar effect by just adding that instead of changing salts. I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I know we're here for Tropic Marin, and I love Tropic Marin, but I know that you guys are going to have these kinds of questions, so I'm just trying to flesh them out as soon as they come up in my mind.
Yeah, and there's no reason you can't use the Reef Active with other salt brands, but use it in the system as directed, not in the water change water.
Right, just to make sure that it works as intended.
Yeah, I'm not saying you couldn't do that. You might be able to do it. I just don't know the science of those salts enough to know if there's anything that would be conflicting there.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And I know you can use it in a tank system.
That makes absolutely perfect sense. Well, since we're talking about salts, we could probably keep talking about salts, and we're gonna
Easy for you to say.
right? We're gonna keep talking about salts in this next video right here. Lou's with me for a couple of days, and we're talking about all kinds of stuff, and we're gonna have a lot of fun doing it. So join us in this video here where we discuss all things Tropic Marin salt and salt in general. I got a lot of questions.
I got a lot of answers.
Perfect.